At this time tomorrow, a new president will be in the White House, hopefully laying out plans to tackle the many crises this country is facing. Already, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have started the transition process, holding a pre-inauguration memorial service for the now 400,000-plus people who've died in the COVID-19 pandemic so far.
The baffled king composing, hallelujah, 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 hallelujah.
And now the nation's attention turns to what we've always emphasized as the peaceful transition of power. But with green zones, red zones, and around 25,000 National Guard troops out in force around D.C., peaceful isn't exactly the first word that comes to mind. And even more troubling, at least 12 National Guard members have been taken off inauguration duty after they were found to have ties to far-right militia groups or having posted extremist views online. As for Trump himself, he's opting out of the big handover ceremony and instead released a pre-taped farewell address. He's also arranged for a military-style send-off at Joint Base Andrews in the morning so he can head off to Mar-a-Lago early. It's a fitting image for a man who's long refused to take any responsibility for any of his actions, skipping town while his successor takes the oath of office under threat of violence, all because of Trump's own self-serving lies. And while he likely could have called off the dogs anytime, simply by admitting to his supporters the truth that he'd lost the election fair and square, instead of setting the record straight, the president is expected to use his final hours in the White House to issue a slew of last-minute pardons, as many as 100 in all. And if this batch is anything like the others, it's likely to include plenty of Trump allies, corrupt politicians, and people who paid big money to Trump associates to help make this happen. But as of this taping, none of it is official just yet. Joining me are retired federal judge Nancy Gertner, now a lecturer at Harvard Law, and Axios politics editor Glen Johnson, a former Globe reporter, former communications aide for Secretary of State John Kerry, and the author of Windows Seat on the World. Glen and Judge Gertner, thank you so much for joining me. Good to see you both.
Good to see you, Jim.
Good to be here.
Judge, you wrote a piece in the Washington Post with Dean Strang of Making a Murderer fame a couple of weeks ago, talking about some of the prior Trump pardons that did address criminal injustice. Granted, we'll give you that. And we know that the pardon power is one of the most absolute in the Constitution. But if pardons are either sold or are traded for silence, there is potential legal liability, even with this absolute power on the part of the president, correct?
Yes, that's right. I mean, in other words, if you say, I'll give you a pardon for your criminal conduct, and in exchange, you don't tell anybody what I did, then that would be the use of the pardon to essentially effect, bribery. You have bribed someone with a pardon power. But it would take, what would happen then is that the prosecution would continue in court. The person would say, I was pardoned. And you would then litigate the legitimacy of that pardon. It's one of the few cases in which the pardon could actually be examined.
Glenn, it seems to me that who he ends up pardoning might have an impact on how many votes for conviction there are in the Senate. For example, if he chooses to pardon some or all of the rioters, which my understanding is he doesn't even need to do by name, that would probably not accrue to his benefit from some of the Republicans who were scared for their lives, correct?
Especially in light of some of the even more shocking video that's come out in the last 48 hours. The New Yorker had a war correspondent on the ground, and he shot footage that they just began airing on Sunday, I believe, that showed people rifling through the desks of senators on the floor. And the police officer that went in there and tried to calmly diffuse the situation said, you're in one of the most sacred places. So that really went into the senator's home turf and violated it. And so if they're given a mass pardon, he's going to definitely agitate those people that are already pretty upset about what happened.
Yeah, it's one thing to violate the Constitution. It's another thing to mess with us, I guess you might say. Speaking of the rioters, Glenn, staying with you, you've referred in your writing to this as Fortress Washington. You just mentioned that Joe Biden just drove by a few minutes ago, but Fortress Washington. And you raise, I think, a really important question, which is, will this loss of freedom be permanent or temporary? What's the answer to your own question?
I think, unfortunately, every security incident always empowers a freedom grab by the authorities. They naturally want to assure safety by creating the biggest possible buffer possible. And so whenever there's an incident, that lends credence to their argument for why that should be the case. And I lived here from 98 to 2003, been coming here ever since. And with every concern, whether it was 9/11, the truck bombing back in 95 in Oklahoma City, and now this insurrection at the Capitol, there's just a further diminution of the public access to these very public places. And it's always under the guise of protecting, the security of the situation. So it becomes one of these arguments that you can't really find fault with, but the people that always pay, whether it's Pennsylvania Avenue being blocked off, during the whole Trump era, a larger buffer in front of the White House fence so you couldn't even stand in front of the fence anymore. Who suffers? It's the normal law-abiding citizens.
But one of the issues I think that I would like to think, Judge Gertner, that would affect that decision, maybe it won't, is whether or not the threat dissipates. And on one hand, I convince myself that even Trump's disappearance will do nothing to cause it to dissipate when people are this angry and this out of touch with reality. But the flip side is, I don't know if you heard this, the rallies that had been organized months before, gun rallies, in the capital of Texas and in the capital of Virginia this weekend were much smaller than they've been in past years. And even the organizers suggested that the arrests of some of the insurrectionists had had a deterrent effect. In your history on the bench, I know we talk a lot about deterrence, but in situations like this, does it work?
I'm not sure that it does. The question is, who was in that crowd, right? Are you talking, sounds like there were people who were there just to demonstrate. There were people who just didn't realize what was going to happen and were there to demonstrate. And there were people then who rushed the Capitol because everybody else was doing it. And then there were people who clearly had an agenda, as the New Yorker piece reflects. People who were, wanted to know where Nancy Pelosi was, who were looking in Cruz's desk, the woman who wanted Nancy Pelosi's computer. Those people, certainly what happened in the Capitol dissuaded the people who were just coming along for the ride, and maybe the people who were opportunistic. I don't know whether it dissuades the hardcore, because one of the scary things is how much, like the ADL and how much the various organizations that are monitoring these groups have seen before, so they were not surprised, even though we are. So I just don't know how hardcore it is.
Can we stay in chronological order? There could be a trial of this president in the Senate imminently, as soon as maybe later this week, maybe next week to begin at earliest. I want to play for you what Mitch McConnell had to say on the floor of the Senate today about last week.
The mob was fed lies. They were provoked by the president and other powerful people. And they tried to use fear and violence to stop a specific proceeding of the first branch of the federal government, which they did not like.
I don't know if you had a head transplant or what, Glenn, but there is a new man, Mitch McConnell. What do you take away from that he's sending a message to his colleagues, that he's covering his own behind? What's the Mitch McConnell? There's always an agenda with Mitch, with most politicians. What's the agenda? What's he saying?
Yes to everything you said. He is definitely covering his tail. It was his party that largely energized a lot of this. He also has a very real concern about the party's continuing ability to fundraise, and that is there's milk of politics, is the ability to fundraise. And you're seeing these major corporations and cutting back funding to individual candidates, as well as the party political action committees, and the Republicans are going to really suffer in that regard. And then also I think there is just a real anger. He fancies himself a man of history, titled his book The Long Game, and I think he knows that this is going to be looked at very harshly in retrospect. And so with his increasingly tart words about Donald Trump, he's giving a lot more cover to Republicans that would want to vote to convict. So that is something that actually is a bit of a change for him. He's been a defender of the president throughout and an enabler in a lot of ways. At this point, though, now it's every man for himself, and he's going to do what's best for himself and his caucus.
Judge Gertner, if this was – I'm sorry, go ahead.
I just also wonder whether this is an opportunity to effect a purge. That essentially
of Trump from the Republican Party.
From the Republican Party. I mean, so the investigations of which House members or senators were complicit in any way. I mean, I wonder whether this is a moment where he can say, I think he said it at one point, we can finally rid the party of Trump and Trumpists. Because he can't control them.
Well, if purge is the goal, and I agree with you, the ultimate purge is not in my estimation, is not a conviction with 67 votes. It's a ban from running for office again allegedly by a majority of votes under the 14th Amendment, where one has allegedly engaged in insurrection or rebellion. Maybe you can settle this issue for me, Judge Gertner. I've read a lot about the 14th Amendment and this issue in the last week or so. Most reporters and politicians say if he is convicted, they could then vote to ban him from running. My reading of the history is even if he's not convicted, they could vote to ban him from running from federal office. Am I right, or are they right?
There are two ways they could ban him. One is through the impeachment power, which says removal and then a separate vote to ban him from office. And the other would be if he were, the other would be under the 14th Amendment, Section 3, which was the provision used to keep Confederate soldiers from running for office in the Reconstruction period. So they could use that, but the predicate, there'd have to be a finding that he engaged in the insurrection. And the question is, what's the entity that would make that finding? So let's imagine Trump is not impeached, or is impeached but not banned from office.
Well, he was impeached, right? Yeah.
Was impeached but was not banned from office. And let's say then that he decides to run in 2024. And the Secretary of State of New York or Florida then not accept his credentials on the grounds that he participated in an insurrection. There would have to be a legal proceeding to determine if that were true. In other words, this doesn't enforce itself.
Speaking of that, we only have a minute left. Starting with you, Judge Gertner, what is Donald Trump's greatest legal liability, apart from potential conviction in the Senate, starting at 12:01 tomorrow? Quickly, if you can.
It's New York State. It's clearly Cyrus Vance, the DA of New York, Suffolk County, New York City, right? He has ongoing financial investigations. It has to do with initially with the payment to Stormy Daniels, but it's much broader than that. There's an attorney general investigation in New York about his various not-for-profits. Georgia State may have an extortion investigation because threatening criminal prosecution to the Secretary of State comprises extortion. Who knows? And then there's the collapse of his financial empire. So who knows at this point? I think we have to wait to see if he's going to pardon himself. Reports say that he's not. But,
and if he does, whether it holds up. Glenn, you have 15 seconds. What on that list do you think Trump fears most?
Oh, I think it's twofold. I think he's really concerned about liquidity for his financial empire, as that Deutsche Bank cutting off funding, or some of these Middle East countries getting nervous about lending him money going forward. And then also, I think the court action in the Southern District of Manhattan, as well as he's got a Georgia Secretary of State who taped an entire phone call. That's pretty solid evidence right there that he's going to have to try and overcome. So both of those things, I think, are very hard for him.
Glen Johnson, Judge Gertner, good to see you both. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
Take care.